Okay, guys, here we are, Coffee and Comics. This is Mike L. and Punisher Max. How you doing?
Hey, I'm doing pretty well.
Okay, this is great. We're here to talk about a very important comic book. It's sometimes considered the greatest Superman story ever done. It's written by Alan Moore, drawn by Kurt Swan, and inked by George Perez and Murphy Anderson.
Yeah.
Yes, this is called Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow. Now, just to give a little bit of context, at the time, Superman had been running for about 48 years, and they were about to reboot Superman. And they had hired Marvel artist John Byrne, who had become famous for doing X-Men and Fantastic Four. They kind of gave him carte blanche to do whatever he wanted with the character. So they thought, well, we know we're going to reboot the character. So before we do that, why don't we have a story where we sort of summarize everything that's come before, wrap it all up before we start over again. So the editor, Julius Schwartz, had an idea where all of Superman's villains kind of came back, and Julius Schwartz pitched the idea to Alan Moore, and Alan Moore said, if you let anyone else do the story, I'll break your legs. So Alan Moore went home, wrote the story, and it was published as the final issue of the original Action Comics of Superman. And to summarize the story, Max, why don't you tell everybody sort of what happens?
So it's basically Superman's rogues gallery comes back. Someone's orchestrating this massive plot, and they're all hitting him right where it hurts. They're all using their powers to like exact precision and taking out Superman. They reveal his identity. They destroy his career.
They murder some of his friends. We won't say who, but they murder some of his very close friends. So what Alan Moore did, which is what he has become famous for now, starting with Miracle Man on through to Watchmen and Supreme, is he's taken these old, hokey, campy ideas and he's turned them on their head.
It's weird. I mean, a lot of it hits you right in the heart. For instance, the very first one where he encounters Bizarro. And it's just so strange. I mean, I had no idea what I was getting into. And it's just this kind of thing where when Lex and Brainiac and all of the other characters show up, there's just something, I don't know. It's Alan Moore has taken these characters and really turned them into something that they never were.
Exactly. And I think one of the keys that makes this story work is that it looks like a 1960s comic and feels like a 1960s comic, but it's Alan Moore sort of doing his version of a Mort Weisinger era Superman comic written by, say, Ed Hamilton or Otto Binder. So it feels like a 60s comic, but there's this weird level of realism, of menace underneath it all, but also an intelligence where he's able to take a hokey character like the Insect Queen and do it in a way that it feels right. It doesn't feel hokey. It doesn't feel forced. You agree with that?
Exactly, yeah. Everything feels so natural in this book where every decision is just like, oh, okay, you know, it's not like, that character would never do that. It's just more like it raises those questions like, why hasn't Lex Luthor and Brainiac done this? Or like it'd be so simple to expose Superman's identity. And that's what happens, you know? Alan Moore takes all of your why haven't theys and
or your what ifs.
Yeah, what ifs, and sort of shows exactly what would happen. Every single thing just follows a logical sort of order, but it's not so logical that you know what's going to happen.
No, it's surprising but inevitable. There's a couple things that happen I want to talk about. First of all, this story came out in 1986. At this point in DC's continuity, Supergirl had already been killed.
Right.
So there is a heart-wrenching moment where Supergirl shows up with the Legion of Superheroes who have traveled from the future. And the dialogue between Superman and Brainiac 5, is it just not heart-wrenching?
It is. It's absolutely masterful. Supergirl raises the question, you know, like, oh, I thought you couldn't travel to a time where you already are. And goes like, Superman, what's going on?
How does this make sense? How can I be here if I must be away in a space mission.
Yeah.
And Superman's like, yeah, that's it. You're away in a space mission. But we all know what's really going on, right? And I think that one of the keys with this comic is the beautiful artwork by Kurt Swan, who has drawn more Superman stories than anyone ever has or ever will. I mean, he did Superman for 30 years straight. It's very unlikely that someone else is going to match his record. So this comic superficially looks like a 1960s comic, but what's happening underneath is just as adult, just as realistic as anything else.
It's even more adult and more realistic than things that are coming out today.
Absolutely.
I mean, this comic doesn't even feel like a DC Superman story. It feels like an indie ripoff of that, where it can comment on itself and get away with it, you know?
You're right. And For the people who did enjoy this story, Alan Moore actually went on in the 90s to do a comic called Supreme. Yeah. Supreme was Rob Liefeld's homage / ripoff of Superman. And the first 40 issues were terrible because they were by Rob Liefeld. But what happened was Alan Moore came on and said, I'll do it under the condition that I can do it like a 1960s Superman. So the closest thing that you can find to this is actually Supreme by Alan Moore, which has a very similar vibe where it looks kind of like a 60s Superman comic, but underneath it's a little bit more intelligent, a little bit more adult. So that's something else that I could recommend as something like this. So
no, yeah, I would agree. Supreme, and then not by Alan Moore, but I would say Invincible may fall closer. Okay. Where it doesn't look like that 1960s vibe, but it definitely has some of that feel to it. It
has a fun superhero vibe. It has the bright colors.
Right, it has the bright colors, but then after, it's also mirrored with like extreme violence.
And also, I do want to point out, there's a commonly held belief nowadays that when any comic book deals with realistic or violent subject matter, that the colors then have to take on a sort of gray wash tone to reflect how dark and realistic they are, right?
Right, like gray washed and gritty means that your book is suddenly going to be
it's adult.
Serious and adult and realistic. But this comic just totally proves them wrong.
It throws it out the window. The comic is done in the old 4-color format. The artwork is the simple Kurt Swan pencils with the heavy black inks, and yet the story is more adult, is more realistic than most modern comics.
It's very Watchmen. You know, because Watchmen was kind of like that, except they used the off colors like yellows, purples, a lot of brown.
Sure.
But Watchmen came off as very colorful, but a little bit gritty just because of the off colors. And this is just very colorful and a little bit gritty, even though it has that standard old school colors. I'm not saying artists today couldn't replicate this, but it would be a much different feel. And I feel like it wouldn't be as impactful, you know? Yeah. We'd have more panels, you know, action would be played out as kind of a montage as opposed to you kind of fill in the gaps with what's happening.
Once again, this is Superman, Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow. It's available in softcover, hardcover. It's collected in many different places. Yeah. I have the original issues right here, not even in a bag. But in any case,
you really should fix that.
I'll work on that today. Possibly the greatest Superman story ever told, Superman, Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow.